what happens when a man who spent decades building an empire suddenly loses control of his own story? What if the very footage meant to preserve his legacy becomes the weapon that destroys it? This is the explosive tale of Sean Diddy Combs, a mogul caught between his public persona and the raw, unfiltered truth that no one was supposed to see. Stay tuned as we dive deep into a fight for his legacy, his identity, and the truth that could either make or break everything he's worked for. The world waited with bated breath for the unveiling of Netflix's highly anticipated documentary series, Sean Diddy Combs, The Reckoning. In the days leading up to the premiere, the air was thick with anticipation. The project, billed as a raw, unfiltered examination of one of hip-hop's most influential figures, had captured the attention of fans, critics, and the media alike. The curiosity surrounding it was palpable. Would it be a salacious exposé or a reflective look at Diddy's monumental rise in the entertainment world? Would it delve into his complex persona, his controversies, and his business empire, or would it explore the man behind the mogul? The excitement reached fever pitch, with viewers around the globe eager to see what secrets, truths, and untold stories would emerge. But on this fateful day, just one day before the documentary's release, a shocking twist turned the whole narrative on its head. Sean Diddy Combs, the iconic music mogul, found himself not on the verge of a cultural moment, but on the brink of an unprecedented battle. It wasn't just the public eye he had to contend with, it was something far more formidable: Netflix, the streaming giant that had become a cultural and media powerhouse in its own right. Diddy, whose career had spanned decades, was now locked in a fight that would define the final chapters of his saga. It was no longer just about promoting his brand, his music, or his image. It was about fighting for control of his own story, a narrative that was now being shaped by someone else. This was a battle of unprecedented proportions, one where the stakes went beyond the realm of celebrity gossip and entertainment industry drama. This was a war for the truth, for Diddy's legacy, and for the very essence of how his story would be told to the world. As millions of viewers eagerly awaited the documentary's premiere, Diddy found himself thrust into a high-stakes legal and public relations struggle with Netflix. What had initially promised to be a moment of triumph for him, a landmark moment in his career, was now fraught with tension, conflict, and a fight for survival. The media mogul, who had spent a lifetime controlling every aspect of his brand and image, now had to navigate the dark and murky waters of a media empire that seemed intent on telling his story their way. What had once been his narrative was now at the mercy of a documentary that threatened to expose the complexities, contradictions, and secrets of his past. For Diddy, the battle had just begun, and it wasn't just about the documentary anymore. It was about defending the very core of who he was in front of an audience that was ready to pass judgment. As the clock ticked down to the premiere, the world held its breath, unsure of how this epic saga would unfold. Would Diddy fight back and regain control, or would the forces of the media and the legal system prove too powerful to overcome? The answer was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the reckoning had only just begun. Diddy's legal team acted with ruthless precision, moving quickly to fire off a cease and desist letter to Netflix. The demand was clear and unambiguous. The streaming giant was to remove Sean Diddy Combs, The Reckoning, from their platform immediately. But this wasn't just another legal maneuver in the endless sea of industry disputes. It wasn't a simple request for a retraction or correction. No, this was far more than that. It was a declaration of war. In that letter, Diddy's lawyers didn't merely ask for the documentary to be taken down. They launched a scathing, all-out assault on Netflix, calling the documentary a shameful hit piece. Every word in that letter carried weight, and Diddy's legal team made it crystal clear that they weren't going to let Netflix get away with this. They accused the streaming giant of far more than just distorting the truth. They claimed Netflix had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The real bombshell, the accusation that Netflix had used stolen footage that was never meant to be seen by the public, footage that Diddy himself had never authorized for release. The stakes were impossibly high now. Diddy wasn't just fighting for his reputation, he was fighting for control over how the world would perceive him. His entire career had been a masterclass in controlling his narrative, carefully curating every aspect of his public persona. Now, for the first time, he found himself at the mercy of a story that someone else was telling about him, but this wasn't a story he could afford to let slip into the world unchecked. It wasn't a mere misunderstanding or a case of journalistic oversight. It was something far more insidious, a personal attack, an effort to rob him of the power to define his own legacy. Diddy's legal team didn't mince words. They argued that the documentary was not simply a biased portrayal of Diddy's life, it was a malicious effort to tarnish his name. They claimed Netflix had gone as far as to use stolen footage that was never intended to be shown to the world. This footage, according to Diddy's team, had been captured by Diddy himself, part of a long-running personal project to document his life in his own terms. But Netflix, they argued, had taken that footage without permission, exploiting it to paint a picture of him that wasn't just inaccurate, but deeply unfair. The accusations didn't stop there. Diddy's legal team alleged that Netflix had used the footage in a highly deceptive way, twisting private, personal moments for dramatic effect. The footage wasn't just a casual behind-the-scenes glimpse. It was the kind of intimate, vulnerable footage that Diddy had kept to himself for years. It wasn't footage meant for public viewing. It was personal, private footage captured in moments of stress, vulnerability, and uncertainty. For Diddy, this was a betrayal of the highest order. The very footage that he had entrusted to a small circle of people, the footage that was meant to be used on his own terms, had been leaked and weaponized. This wasn't just about a documentary anymore. It was about control, trust, and respect. Diddy wasn't going to sit idly by while someone else hijacked his story. He had spent his entire career carefully curating his image, making sure every detail of his public persona aligned with the brand he had built. Now, with this documentary, he was facing an existential threat to everything he had worked for. His team knew that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a direct attack on his life's work. And Diddy was prepared to fight back with everything at his disposal. The legal battle was about far more than just legal rights. It was about the very essence of who Diddy was. The man who had spent decades building a multi-billion-dollar empire, meticulously curating every detail of his public image, now found himself in a battle to protect his reputation, his legacy, and his very identity. This was personal. Diddy wasn't just trying to stop a documentary, he was trying to reclaim control over his own narrative, over the way his life would be remembered. With everything at stake, Diddy's legal team didn't just threaten legal action, they made it clear that they were prepared to escalate the fight to the highest levels. They were ready for war, and they weren't going to let Netflix or anyone else shape the story of Diddy's life without a fight. It was a bold move, one that sent a message not just to Netflix, but to the entire world. When it came to controlling his legacy, Diddy would stop at nothing to protect it. This wasn't just a legal challenge, it was a fight for his soul, his story, and the very truth of who he was. What had initially seemed like a routine legal request quickly morphed into something far more intense, a full-fledged war. Diddy's legal team wasn't simply battling to stop a documentary from airing. The stakes had become immeasurably higher. This wasn't just about preventing a film from being shown to the public. No, this was a battle to defend something far more valuable. A legacy that had taken decades to build, a reputation that had been meticulously curated, and most importantly, the fundamental right to control the narrative of his own life. For Diddy, the fight was about far more than just the contents of a documentary. It was about the power to shape the story that would be told about him, both now and long after his career had ended. This was not merely a matter of public relations or a media dispute. It was a fight for control over the very essence of his identity. For a man who had spent his entire career carefully crafting every aspect of his image, every decision, and every public statement, losing control over how his story would be told was simply not an option. His legacy, the one he had worked so tirelessly to create, was now at risk of being defined by someone else on someone else's terms. Diddy's team understood that this was bigger than just one documentary. It was about setting a precedent for how his life would be remembered. The fight for control over his narrative wasn't just about one moment in time, but about ensuring that his story was told on his own terms, free from manipulation and distortion. They were standing at the gates, ready to protect everything Diddy had worked for, and they knew the battle would be fierce. The stakes had grown to monumental proportions, and the consequences of losing control were too great to ignore. This wasn't a fight he was willing to lose.
I think when you tell a story about anybody, you could tell multiple stories. There's another story about Puff you could tell that would leave you feeling different about him. That would also be true.
Okay, I get it.
But this one, it felt true.
Diddy wasn't just defending his reputation or legacy. He was defending the very right to control his truth, his image, and his future. As the legal battle raged on, it became increasingly clear this was no longer a simple legal matter. This was a fight for his identity itself, and Diddy would stop at nothing to ensure his story was told in the way he believed it deserved to be. The war for his narrative had begun, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to win. But what truly made this situation explosive wasn't merely the accusation of stolen footage, it was the content of the footage itself. Leaked clips began circulating across the internet, sending shockwaves through the media and the public alike. These weren't just casual, behind-the-scenes shots that offered a glimpse into Diddy's life. No, these were intimate, raw, and never-before-seen moments. The footage revealed Diddy at his most vulnerable. Just days before his highly publicized arrest in September 2024, what made this so much more than just another tabloid moment was the nature of the footage itself. These weren't choreographed moments or staged encounters. They were candid, private conversations between Diddy and his lawyers. Conversations that weren't meant for the world to hear. Conversations that were never intended to be exposed to the public eye. The kind of moments that most people would keep behind closed doors, moments of stress, frustration, and strategy in the midst of a personal and legal crisis. For Diddy, these weren't just private discussions, they were his innermost thoughts, his plans for survival, his fears, and his reflections on the storm that had been brewing around him. These were the kinds of conversations that happen behind the closed doors of a war room, where decisions are made in the heat of battle, and every word is crucial. But now, thanks to the leaked footage, these highly personal, deeply sensitive exchanges were laid bare for the world to dissect. The privacy that Diddy had once assumed was his right had been violently stripped away. The rawness of the footage made it even more damaging. These weren't moments captured for a public-facing project, but for a private documentary Diddy had intended to use to tell his own story on his own terms. The footage wasn't just exposing his vulnerability, it was threatening to expose a version of him that he had never intended for anyone to see. And with each passing hour as the clips continued to spread, the world was getting a front row seat to the unraveling of a carefully constructed empire. This was no longer just about Diddy's legacy, it was about the painful, messy truth that no one was supposed to see. In these clips, viewers were given an unvarnished, unprecedented look at Diddy, vulnerable, stressed, and clearly at his breaking point. Gone was the confident, larger-than-life mogul the world had come to know. In his place was a man who, for the first time in his life, appeared deeply human, his facade cracking under the weight of the storm that was threatening to destroy everything he had built. Diddy had spent decades crafting an empire, meticulously shaping his public persona as a fearless businessman, a cultural icon, and a mogul who could never be touched. He had mastered the art of control, building a legacy that spanned music, fashion, and entertainment. But now, as the footage revealed, he was watching that empire slowly unravel in real time. The footage captured him pacing back and forth in what appeared to be a tense strategy session with his lawyers. There were no rehearsed lines, no polished speeches, just raw, unfiltered conversations about legal strategies, defenses, and the mountain of challenges he was facing. In these private moments, the weight of the world seemed to bear down on him. His voice, once commanding and authoritative, was now tinged with frustration and uncertainty. He wasn't the man who had confidently navigated Hollywood, the man who had built Bad Boy Records and countless other ventures. No, this was a man at war with the very forces he had once controlled so effortlessly. It became painfully clear, this wasn't the suave, untouchable mogul the public had admired for years. This was a man who had fought tooth and nail for everything he had, now desperate to hold on to the pieces that were slipping through his fingers. The empire he had spent a lifetime building was now on the brink of collapse, and there was no easy way to stop the avalanche that was coming for him. The rawness of the footage was its power. It stripped away the layers of fame and fortune and exposed a side of Diddy that few had ever seen, vulnerable, human, and most surprisingly uncertain. The public was watching a man in crisis, and for the first time it was clear that even someone like Diddy, a man who had crafted his image as a symbol of invincibility, could fall apart. The empire he had built, the walls of control he had so carefully erected, were now crumbling in the world. Diddy was getting a front row seat to his unraveling. The footage was shocking not just because of its content, but because of its context. These weren't carefully crafted public speeches or orchestrated interviews. These were raw, unfiltered moments, private, confidential conversations between Diddy and his legal team, recorded during the lead-up to one of the most critical and tumultuous crises of his career. These were the kinds of exchanges that were never meant to be seen by the public. They were intimate moments, designed to remain behind closed doors, shielded from the judgment and scrutiny of the world. What made the footage even more devastating was the fact that it had been captured over the course of many years, not as a one-time, spontaneous event, but as a long-term project, one Diddy himself had initiated. This footage wasn't part of a commercial documentary or an outside narrative imposed upon him. It was his footage, filmed by him, meant to tell his story on his terms. Diddy had spent years meticulously capturing the highs and lows of his life, planning to use this personal archive to shape his own narrative when the time was right. This was footage that had been carefully curated to reflect his journey, his struggles, and his triumphs. It was intended to be a testament to his legacy, a visual record of his own truth. But now this same footage was being ripped from its intended context and thrust into the public eye by a documentary filmmaker and a media outlet looking to capitalize on his pain, his vulnerability, and his downfall. In a sense, this wasn't just a breach of privacy, it was a violation of Diddy's control over his own story. The footage was never meant to be exposed this way. It wasn't meant to be sensationalized, twisted, or turned into entertainment for a global audience. Diddy had taken control of his narrative for years, but now it seemed that control had slipped through his fingers, leaving him at the mercy of others who were eager to profit from the very crisis he had worked so hard to avoid. This wasn't just about the content of the footage, it was about the context, the manipulation of a deeply personal story, once meant to be told in his own time and on his own terms, now being used to sell a narrative that wasn't his own. Diddy's spokesperson, Judah Engelmeyer, wasted no time jumping into action.
He said he never witnessed Diddy physically doing something to someone like that because he would have checked him, but he heard the stories.
He immediately reached out to TMZ, offering a sharp rebuttal to the growing narrative that was spreading like wildfire. Engelmeyer wasn't content to sit back and let the accusations against Netflix go uncontested. He had a different perspective, one that painted the streaming giant in a far more troubling light. According to Engelmeyer, Netflix didn't simply acquire this footage, they stole it. But the theft, Engelmeyer argued, wasn't as direct as one might think. The footage hadn't been taken straight from Diddy's hands. Instead, it had been recorded by Diddy's personal videographer, someone who had been following him for years, capturing intimate moments of his life as part of a personal project. This videographer had been entrusted with the task of documenting Diddy's journey, his rise to stardom, his triumphs, his struggles, and the intricate layers of his story that the world had never seen. It wasn't a commercial project meant for the public eye. It was a long-term endeavor that Diddy had carefully planned, one that was meant to tell his story when the time was right and on his own terms. The videographer had been an intimate part of Diddy's life, capturing everything behind the scenes as he navigated the complexities of fame, business, and personal turmoil. Diddy had trusted this individual to document his journey for himself, not for a documentary filmmaker or a media company looking to capitalize on his image. This was footage that was never meant to be released to the public. It was personal, raw, and unedited. Yet now it was out there, stolen from the very heart of the project Diddy had been building for years. In Engelmeyer's eyes, this wasn't just about unauthorized footage, it was a betrayal. A breach of trust, not only between Diddy and Netflix, but between a man and the people he had once trusted to preserve the integrity of his narrative. The very people Diddy had relied on to document his life had now, in Engelmeyer's view, turned against him. The personal project meant to shape his own story was now being used against him, twisted into something far darker than Diddy could have ever anticipated. And Engelmeyer wasn't going to let Netflix walk away from this without facing the consequences of what they had done. This footage, Engelmeyer passionately argued, was never meant for Netflix. It was never intended to be broadcast to the world. It was a deeply personal archive, a collection of moments meant to remain private, captured with the sole purpose of one day allowing Diddy to tell his own story on his own terms when he was ready. This footage was never meant to be fodder for the media, certainly not for a documentary produced without Diddy's consent or involvement. Instead, Engelmeyer claimed Netflix had gone beyond simple misrepresentation. They had allegedly taken the footage out of context. What had been a private, raw, and authentic record of Diddy's life, a series of moments he had captured for his own purposes, was now being used to weave a narrative that was far from the truth. A narrative that painted him in a light he had never intended. This wasn't just about unauthorized footage. It was about manipulating his personal story to fit a narrative that was crafted without his voice, without his involvement, and without his permission. Diddy had spent years carefully curating his life story, preserving his journey in the hope that one day he would have the chance to share it when the time was right. But Netflix, according to Engelmeyer, had seized on this footage for their own gain, twisting it to serve a version of events that didn't reflect Diddy's reality. It was no longer about his legacy or his truth. It was about crafting an explosive, sensational story that would captivate audiences and generate views, regardless of the consequences. Engelmeyer's words echoed with frustration and a sense of betrayal. This was more than just an issue of control. It was an infringement on Diddy's very right to tell his own story, to define his own narrative. The footage, once a private reflection of a life lived under constant public scrutiny, had been stolen, misused, and distorted. And the legal team made it clear they were not going to let this breach go unnoticed or unchallenged, but the plot thickened even further. Just when it seemed like the stakes couldn't get any higher, Diddy's legal team revealed something even more explosive, something that would shift the entire foundation of the case. According to them, the footage included not only personal moments and private conversations, but also confidential exchanges between Diddy and his lawyers. These were conversations that were shielded by the sacred bond of attorney-client privilege, a cornerstone of legal ethics that ensures clients can speak freely with their attorneys without fear of their words being exposed to the world. These weren't just casual chats, these were deeply private, strategic discussions. They were reflections of Diddy's most irreparable moments where he let down his guard and entrusted his legal team with his concerns, his fears, and his plans for the future. These were the conversations where he revealed his innermost thoughts, the kinds of discussions that happen only in the most confidential spaces. And now, according to Diddy's team, these sacred conversations had been exposed to the public, ripped from their protected context, and used for dramatic effect in a documentary that had nothing to do with justice or truth. The breach of trust was nothing short of unprecedented. The legal team argued that this wasn't just a case of unauthorized footage, it was an outright violation of the very principles that govern the legal system. To exploit attorney-client privilege in this way was not only a legal misstep, it was an act of betrayal. The foundation of trust between Diddy and his legal team had been shattered, and the consequences were profound. What was once a safe space for private, strategic planning had been transformed into a weapon to further an agenda that had nothing to do with Diddy's truth. This was no longer just about a documentary. It was about the erosion of a man's right to privacy, to security, and to the protection that the law affords every individual. Diddy's legal team knew that this was an unforgivable breach, one that went beyond the scope of simple media exploitation. It was a betrayal of the most personal kind, and they were prepared to fight to ensure that justice was served. The battle was no longer just about stopping a documentary. It was about restoring the sanctity of private, confidential conversations, and in doing so protecting Diddy's most fundamental rights. The footage itself painted a chilling and undeniable contrast between Diddy's carefully constructed public persona and the raw, often painful reality of his private life. One particular clip filmed in his old neighborhood showed Diddy greeting fans with a beaming smile, posing for pictures, and playing the part of the beloved mogul, the larger-than-life figure everyone admired and respected. He was the embodiment of success, the charismatic entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing. But as the camera followed him, the veneer of fame, which had been so meticulously crafted over the years, quickly began to crack. What followed the smiles and fanfare was something far darker, far more unsettling. Behind the public facade, Diddy was seen pacing in a hotel room, his face a mask of frustration and growing desperation. He was deep in conversation with his legal team, discussing his mounting legal woes, demanding better results from his lawyers, and expressing a level of frustration that no one had ever seen in the polished, self-assured mogul. This was the man who had built an empire on confidence, control, and unwavering belief in his ability to dominate any industry. But now, in this vulnerable moment, he was shown struggling to maintain his grip on everything he had worked for. The empire he had so carefully constructed was crumbling before his eyes, and the world was watching as it unfolded. It was a shocking revelation. Diddy, at the height of his success, was visibly crumbling under the weight of his own creation. This wasn't just a case of leaked footage. It was a deeply personal attack on a man who had spent years controlling his narrative. To expose this level of vulnerability, to strip away the layers of self-assurance and expose the raw, human side of Diddy was not just a journalistic misstep, it was a violation of trust. It wasn't simply about showing the cracks in Diddy's persona. It was an assault on his image, his legacy, and his private struggles. In response, Diddy's legal team went on the offensive, accusing Netflix not only of exploiting his vulnerability, but of being complicit in the betrayal. They didn't just blame the filmmakers behind the documentary, they aimed their ire squarely at the man who had made this entire project possible, Ted Sarandos, Netflix's CEO. Sarandos, once a figure of admiration and respect in Diddy's eyes, had now become a symbol of everything that was wrong with this documentary. Diddy's legal team made it clear, this wasn't just about the content of the documentary itself, it was about the people behind it. For years, Diddy had held Sarandos in high regard, especially through Sarandos' connection to the late Clarence Abbott, a figure Diddy deeply admired.
And that we, in particular parties, right, we're told that there were a lot of parties with a lot of stuff going on at those parties, and he was a little boy.
But now, with Netflix airing a documentary about Diddy's life, produced by his longtime adversary 50 Cent, Diddy felt nothing short of betrayed. It wasn't just the airing of the documentary that cut him to the core, it was the fact that Netflix had handed creative control of his life story to someone who had been publicly feuding with him for years. The personal history between Diddy and 50 Cent was well documented, a bitter rivalry fueled by years of public insults and attacks. The idea that Sarandos, a man Diddy had once respected, would allow such a personal vendetta to be woven into a documentary about his life was, in Diddy's mind, an unforgivable betrayal. To Diddy, this wasn't just a documentary about him. It was a weapon, wielded by the very people who had spent years chipping away at his public image. It was a direct attack on the man he had spent so long building up in the eyes of the world. For Diddy's legal team, the message was clear. Netflix had not only exploited his personal footage without permission, they had handed control of his narrative to the very man who had been working to tear him down for years. The documentary wasn't simply a reflection of his life, it was a tool used to further the agenda of his greatest enemy. And that, Diddy's team argued, was something they would not allow to stand uncontested. Diddy's legal team escalated the situation further, suggesting that this documentary was about more than just an unsanctioned portrayal of his life. It was an act of corporate retaliation. According to their version of events, the roots of this conflict went back years. Sarandos, the CEO of Netflix, had allegedly approached Diddy with the idea of creating a documentary about his life. However, Diddy had turned it down, making the conscious decision to maintain control over his own narrative. He wasn't interested in handing the reins to anyone else, especially not to a media powerhouse that could shape the story any way they saw fit. He wanted to tell his story on his own terms in his own time. Now, according to Diddy's legal team, this refusal to play by Netflix's rules had led to a deliberate act of revenge. By handing the documentary project to Diddy's biggest adversary, 50 Cent, Netflix was allegedly sending a message. It wasn't just about telling Diddy's story, it was about making sure that the story told was one that would reflect Diddy in a way he never intended. It was about punishing him for rejecting Netflix's offer years ago by giving creative control of his life's story to someone who had been publicly feuding with him for years. The theory that Netflix was orchestrating this as a personal vendetta against Diddy was dramatic, yes, but to Diddy it felt all too plausible. After all, the stakes were impossibly high and the timing couldn't have been more suspicious. In his eyes, this wasn't just a documentary, it was a weapon aimed directly at his reputation and legacy. It was a calculated move designed to hurt him personally and professionally, all in response to his decision to turn down Netflix's earlier offer. The accusations were bold and brimming with drama, but the question lingered. Was this simply the latest chapter in a long-running feud between Diddy and 50 Cent, or was there something deeper, more strategic at play? Diddy's legal team was unwavering. They didn't mince words. They made it clear they were prepared to fight this battle to the bitter end, and if necessary, they were ready to take Netflix to court. Given Diddy's well-documented history with legal disputes, particularly with major media outlets, this was no empty threat. Diddy had previously made headlines by suing NBC Universal for $100 million over a defamation case related to a documentary about him that aired on Peacock. If it came to it, taking Netflix to court would be just another chapter in his long history of fiercely protecting his reputation and legacy through legal means. It was a fight he knew well, and this time he was ready to go to war not just for his personal narrative but for the principle of control itself, but Netflix stood firm. Their response came swiftly, resolutely, and without hesitation. They flatly denied Diddy's claims, asserting that the footage had been legally obtained and that they had every right to use it as they saw fit. The streaming giant was unwavering in their defense, emphasizing that despite 50 Cent's involvement as an executive producer, he had no creative control over the project. According to Netflix, the documentary was the result of a fair and lawful acquisition of footage. They had crossed all the necessary legal T's and dotted the I's, and they were confident in their position. The film, they insisted, was a product of due diligence and respect for the rights of the footage's sources, and they would not be bullied into pulling it down. As the months passed, the documentary not only survived the legal storm, it thrived. It continued to dominate the Netflix charts for MLY, cementing its place in the cultural conversation. The world watched as Diddy's empire, once untouchable, seemed to unravel in real time, exposed to the world in a way he had never anticipated. What had once been a symbol of his success and influence, the mogul who had built an empire from the ground up, the visionary who had redefined the music and fashion industries, was now facing public scrutiny like never before. His brand, his carefully crafted public image, was now being questioned and examined by millions, many of whom had admired him for years. The very obsession that had propelled him to the heights of his career, the need to document every single moment of his life, had become the tool that brought him down. Diddy had spent decades meticulously capturing his life story, not just for the world, but for himself. These were the images he had hoped to use one day to control his narrative, to share the truth on his own terms. But now that very footage, once meant to protect his legacy, was being used to tell a very different story. It was a cruel twist of fate, the ultimate irony. The king of branding, a man who had built his empire by controlling every aspect of his image, was now being undone by that very obsession with control. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was intensely personal. And as the world watched, Diddy's mother, Janice Combs, couldn't stay silent. She had seen enough. As the documentary spread like wildfire, she stepped forward to defend her son, her voice filled with the emotion and fierceness only a mother could possess. In a heartfelt statement, Janice vehemently lashed out against the documentary, claiming that it was filled with deliberate lies, inaccuracies, and misrepresentations of her son's life. She took issue with every twist of the narrative, every claim that painted Diddy in an unflattering light. Her statement wasn't just a defense of her son's reputation, it was a mother's plea to restore the dignity of her family. Janice knew the truth about Diddy's upbringing, about his sacrifices, and about the man he had become. To her, the documentary was not just an attack on Diddy's career, it was an attack on their family, on their legacy. It was a painful blow, one that she wasn't going to accept without a fight. She took aim at what she saw as the distortion of her family's history, and her words were filled with the anguish of a mother who had watched her son build an empire, only to see it torn down by those who didn't understand the full picture.
Upbringing and quality education for my child. I raised Sean with love and hard work, not abuse. The allegations that my son slapped me while we were conversing after the tragic City College event are inaccurate and patently false.
But despite the raw emotion and the power of Janice's defense, it became increasingly clear that the damage had already been done. The footage that had been exposed to the world painted a different story, one that couldn't simply be erased by the loving words of a mother or the well-crafted statement of a legal team. The documentary had already become a cultural phenomenon, a story that millions had consumed, dissected, and judged. It wasn't just about the content of the film, it was about the way it had shaped Diddy's public image, one that could never be fully restored. The world had seen the footage, had heard Diddy's own words, his private struggles, and his vulnerabilities. That version of his story, the raw, unfiltered look at his life, had already been set in the public consciousness. Janice's defense, as powerful and heartfelt as it was, couldn't undo the impact of the footage that had been shown. The story had already been told, and it was one that couldn't be easily forgotten. No amount of denial, no amount of love could change the fact that the world had seen Diddy at his most human, his most vulnerable. The rawness of the footage had left an indelible mark, and that version of Diddy, struggling, pacing, frustrated, and vulnerable, was now part of the narrative surrounding his legacy. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It wasn't just a matter of trying to stop a documentary from airing. It was a fight for Diddy's very identity, his reputation, and his future. And as the documentary continued to dominate Netflix, as the criticism and support poured in from every corner of the world, one question loomed large. Could Diddy ever fully reclaim his narrative, or had the damage been done in a way that no amount of legal action or public defense could undo? For Diddy, the personal and professional consequences of the documentary were undeniable. His mother's heartfelt defense couldn't change the fact that his carefully crafted image had been irrevocably altered. The battle to control his own story had escalated beyond anyone's control, and in the end, it seemed that the empire he had spent a lifetime building was now at the mercy of forces much greater than himself. The documentary had evolved into something far greater than just a film. It had become a cultural reckoning, an exploration of power, betrayal, and the fragility of a family's legacy. What had once been intended as a personal project to reflect Diddy's triumphs, struggles, and self-crafted persona had now morphed into a public spectacle, with millions of viewers dissecting his every move, every flaw, and every mistake. The stakes were no longer confined to the realm of entertainment or business. They had transcended into the very core of who Diddy was. For him, this wasn't simply a fight for his reputation. It was a battle for his identity, his legacy, and the authenticity of the story that defined him. He had spent decades building a carefully curated public image, an empire of control, success, and influence. But now that image was under attack, and the world was seeing him through a lens that was far different from the one he had constructed. His carefully cultivated narrative, once meticulously designed to showcase strength, triumph, and invincibility, was being dismantled in front of millions of viewers who saw a man who was struggling, vulnerable, and human. As the dust began to settle, the question that loomed large over everything was a difficult one. Could the truth of his past ever be reclaimed? Could the raw, unfiltered moments of his life, the footage that had now been irrevocably exposed to the world, be redefined in a way that restored his control over his own narrative? Or was the damage to his legacy, to his image, and to his story irreversible? The battle for Diddy's reputation was no longer just about the documentary. It was about the very essence of who he was. Could he rise above this public scrutiny and reclaim the narrative that had been taken from him? Or was he destined to be defined by the very footage that had been meant to preserve his truth? The outcome of this battle was unclear, but one thing was certain: Diddy would never be the same again. His legacy had been altered, and how the world would remember him had been forever changed by a single, explosive documentary. The question now was whether he could rebuild, or if the weight of his past would prove too much to overcome. So what do you think? Can Diddy rebuild his legacy, or is the damage irreversible? Is his story forever changed, or can he rise from the ashes of this betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on this ongoing saga. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of Diddy's fight for his legacy.